In this episode, we sit down for a conversation with renowned rock photographer Bob Gruen. Bob has been documenting the artists, concerts, and clubs that have come to define rock music, and is responsible for some of the most iconic images of the idiom. In his over 50-year career, he has photographed the likes of Elvis Presley, John Lennon, Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa, Harry Nilsson, the Rolling Stones, The Clash, The Who, and so many others. Bob talks with John and Stewart about his artistic philosophy, his move from film to digital, his relationship with John and Yoko, and what it's been like on the other side of the camera as music history happened. Bob's voice is a little grainy in this interview due to connection issues, but his spirit and stories come through loud and clear.
Hey, it's really great to have you on.
Well, thank you.
It means a lot to us. Your photos were part of our growing up, all of us.
Yes.
So
it's really great to have you. And, you know, like we talk mostly about music and making records, but we also go out of our sort of wheelhouse a little bit and reach out to artists that we love who are, you know, work parallel to what John and I do. We're both recording engineers, record producers, and it's all sort of about how you get to document something. And John and I have spent our lives documenting in recording studios, and you're doing the same thing. You're documenting these moments in time, and we all happen to be doing it largely in the music world. How did that come about that you...
All the people I meet were in music. I learned from my mother when I was very little, and became the family photographer, and it became my main hobby, and I was taking pictures for the school newspapers and so on. And then after high school, I tried to go to college, but it didn't really work for me. And, you know, the idea from Timothy Leary, to turn on, tune in, and drop out, was much more appealing. And so I basically dropped out to live with a rock and roll band, not knowing that I was really falling in, because, as I said, photography was my hobby. I took pictures of my friends. But when the band I was living with got a record deal, Atlantic Records used my pictures of them for their promotion. And they liked them, and they hired me to do some more. And each time I went to do a job, I would meet more people, and they'd hire me to do more jobs. And so it just kind of snowballed until that's what I was doing. My plan had been to do nothing, you know, until, I found out you do have to do something in order to pay your rent. You know, I lived with a few friends, and in our first two apartments, we managed to scrounge up the 3 months, advance rent and security. And then 3 months later, we'd get tossed out because we didn't have any more money after that, you know. So
right.
That happened twice before I figured out that you have to make money somehow.
So we're talking the 60s, right?
Yeah, I moved into the city around 65, I think.
Wow.
Right, but there was a sort of a burgeoning jazz scene happening, but you fell into the rock world?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's just who I knew. People who went from like, I actually have a lot of jazz records I used to get back then. Roland Kirk, who I think is a rock and roller, you know, and Miles Davis and people like that. But then my friends were playing rock and roll, and I just kind of fell more into that. And then I met Ike and Tina Turner in 1970. I took some pictures at a club. We went to see a show a couple days later, and I brought the pictures with me to show to my friends. And one of my friends pushed me in front of Ike Turner, and one moment changed my life because Ike liked
amazing.
I started traveling with Ike and Tina Turner, and that really introduced me to a lot of people. That's really basically when my career started.
Is there any, you know, because John and I, when you produce a record, you're not in the studio with another producer. You're kind of alone, and you go through, all of a sudden you wind up, you've had your career, and you've sort of been doing it by yourself. But is there a community of photographers that you sort of can throw around ideas with? And
no, I wouldn't say so. I mean, there's a couple of photographers I'm friends with, one or two. I don't think we really throw ideas around. Photographers that I know are extremely competitive. It's very difficult to get jobs, and you don't get paid very much for them. So you have to get a lot of jobs if you want to pay your rent. So most of the photographers I know are very competitive. We don't share ideas or tips or anything like that.
Interesting.
At one point in the 80s, a group of photographers tried to form a photographers guild, so to speak, a trade group.
Right.
Because when I started in the early 70s, they didn't have the term rock photography. There was one guy doing the music business before we came, and then me and Chuck Pullen and one or two other people, Neil Preston in the early days, started taking pictures for bands. And eventually, as more and more people were doing it, it got the name rock photography. And by the 80s, as merchandise became so much more valuable, I remember it was 1986, a manager said to me they made more money they made $18 on a $16 ticket. You know, somebody would pay $16 for a ticket, but they were spending $18 on merchandise. Wow. And so the merchandise became more important than the show. And there was a lot of bootlegging because merchandise was worth a lot. And the managers thought that by controlling the photography, they could somehow control the bootlegs. It's a completely unfounded idea.
Right.
No bootlegger ever bought a picture from me,
right.
for anybody.
Right.
Most bootleggers that I see at concerts take an album cover or the record company publicity picture that everybody knows, and they sell that.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
T-shirt or a sweatshirt or whatever. They don't get photos from legitimate photographers, but for some reason, managers thought that if they limit the photography, they'll somehow limit the merchandise, and that's when they came up with the 3-song rule that you could always take pictures for the first 3 songs, and then you have to get out. For me, that was kind of almost a deal breaker because I'm trying to capture the feeling and the passion of the show, and the feeling and the passion is not evident in the first 2 songs.
Right.
Right.
People run on stage, they're running back and forth trying to get everybody's attention. Around the 5th song, they do the power ballad and they stand still for a minute. It's not till the encore that they turn on all the lights and the guns and explosions and, you know, the confetti comes out, and then you got all the excitement.
Yeah.
You know, I'm there to capture the passion and the feeling of what's going on.
Right.
So in the mid-'80s, as this 3-song rule was expanding, a group of photographers decided to get together to oppose that. And if we oppose it as a group, and all photographers refuse to shoot only 3 songs, like if you limit us to 3 songs, we won't take pictures of your group. That lasted about an hour and a half. Because we had a meeting. Don Hill let us use the Cat Club. There's about 25, 30 photographers actually showed up. We all decided that was a great idea, and that night there was some kind of heavy metal band was playing, and that was going to be the first example. We're going to refuse to photograph it. Well, 3 of the photographers figured if nobody else was taking the pictures, their pictures were going to be worth so much more. So they went.
Oh, God.
So the photography guild lasted about 4 hours. You know?
It sounds like my second marriage.
Yeah, well, it's like that, isn't it? The best ideas don't always work out. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because this, I guess I've been reading about this Lynn Goldsmith thing with Andy Warhol.
Right.
Do you have any thought on that? Because I don't know.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on that, yeah. Andy Warhol licensed the picture from Lynn to make a artwork out of it for a magazine. And then he went and made lithographs that they sold for tens of thousands of dollars from that same license. And now they're claiming that they don't need to license because he altered the photo enough that it's not the photo. Now, the funny story was in the Post because they had Lynn Goldsmith's picture and they had Andy's picture. And he said the judge thinks these 2 pictures are different. If you look at the 2 pictures, it's obvious that Andy put some color on Lynn's picture.
Right.
It didn't change the picture.
Right.
It's just a little more colorful.
Right.
The point that I think that they should, because I listened to the arguments, it's a very important case because if Lynn loses, then just about anybody will be able to put a pencil mark on a photograph and call it their own.
Right.
Right.
If she wins, nobody's going to be able to draw on a picture without permission.
Right.
Right.
So I'm kind of in favor of her winning. You know?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
And my point that, you know, just listening to the case, the fact that Warhol licensed the photo the first time proves that they knew, you know, that they felt and they knew that she owned the photo and they needed permission to alter it. So if they asked for a license, why do they deny the need for it 10 years later?
Right.
Right.
You know, back to the sort of the similarities in the art forms. When you shoot somebody, when you're shooting, I know you shoot a lot of live stuff, but you also do portraits and stuff. The vibe that you create, there has to be some magic in getting people to sort of a place where, like I've noticed just looking at a bunch of your pictures, a lot of people are smiling. They're often there's often sort of a beauty in the fact that, and I don't think that just happens in nature. I would have to imagine that somehow you're on the other side of the lens.
Well, they're smiling at me.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Something about my personality that relaxes people and allows them to smile.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that too, Stewart. The vibes of so many of the pictures, everybody's super happy. The one with Iggy is great because he's got the Iggy face, but you could tell he's super into it. There's a magic there for sure.
And then you sort of maintain relationships with these artists and they become friends as well as...
Well, when I can. I mean, not everybody becomes a friend. Not everybody's, some people I see for 10 minutes. I'm on assignment. I take a picture and I leave. Some people I meet and I'm still friends with 40, 50 years later.
Yeah, incredible.
It just depends. I can't tell people how to make friends, But in my life, I've always gotten along more with artists and musicians, creative type people. It's just the lifestyle I live or the kind of attitudes I have. I get along with those kind of people.
Yeah. Again, that's similar to John and myself. Most of our friends have come from our work.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're insular about it, but it just grows in that
it's
direction.
The way life happens that way. You end up growing up, you have to do some kind of work to pay your rent.
Yeah.
And you meet people where you work. It's not like all your friends are outside of work. It's just makes sense. You meet like-minded people where you work.
Right.
Yeah. I also feel like spending like 2 or 3 weeks in a room, like a studio with a group of people. By the end of that time, you either really get along great and you will be friendly for a long time or you'll want to kill each other.
I always remember one time there was an engineer, Yoko used to record a lot of albums. And you're right, you spend 2 or 3 months every single night in a small little dark room together. You really get to know each other and appreciate being together. And one time, it was the last session, the engineer was saying goodbye and said, I hope I see you again soon. We can get together again. And Yoko says, yes, as soon as we have some more work.
Right.
And that's what it is for me sometimes. I get to work with people and you do something intense, but then when the work is done, you don't see them again for a while until you have more work.
Right.
I get on a bus with a band. I'm not going to be there all year,
Right.
Tour is over, you say goodbye, you go back to wherever you live.
Yeah.
You were at Woodstock, right?
As a camper, yes.
Okay, so you didn't shoot there at all.
I wasn't working as a photographer yet, no.
Oh, okay, gotcha. But what was that like just to camp?
Absolutely amazing. You kind of built up to that. I was camping since I was a kid and Boy Scouts, stuff like that. So I was actually good with a tent and outdoor cooking and stuff like that. I didn't just walk into the woods. I had a tent, I had a sleeping bag, I had a knapsack full of pots and pans. I take care of myself outside. But I remember clearly sitting in my studio. I remember where my desk was and everything. And I saw the Village Voice, and there was this big full-page ad and all these names of bands and everything. And right in the middle, it said The Who. And I took out my checkbook and I mailed in a check for 4 tickets because I was going to go see The Who.
Right on.
So I always went to see The Who.
Right.
Wherever they played, I saw if they were within 100 miles of New York City, I was there.
That's amazing.
All through the 60s into the 70s, until Keith died. I was a massive fan.
Right.
And in fact, after Keith died, I went to Fréjus in France at the Cannes Film Festival, where The Who played the first show after Keith, which was pretty amazing. But without him, the whole vibe changed, and it became more of Pete Townshend's orchestra. They should change the name and call it Pete Townsend Orchestra.
Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of funny because I was very drunk when I saw The Who in the early days. And then when I sobered up at one point, I think in the 90s, I went with my agent to Madison Square Garden, and The Who were playing. And they had singers and violin players and, horn players. It was like a whole, layers. There was the band, and then there was some hot risers and some more risers and all. There had 20 people on stage. And I turned to my agent and I said, I always thought of The Who was just those 3, 4 guys. I must have been so fucking drunk. I missed the orchestra. No wonder that voice sounded so good. It's an orchestra to replace Keith Moon.
Yeah.
Keith Moon put out 85% of the sound of The Who.
Yeah. Did you see them with Kenny Jones? Is that who was playing drums?
Yeah, from in Albany, I think, or something. Or maybe the Garden too with Kenny Jones. He was technically perfect, and that wasn't with the Who. The Who was mad and crazy, and he was very sane, almost like Glenn Matlock and the Sex Pistols. Some people are really, really good, but they're in the wrong band.
Right. Yeah, right.
The nicest guy in music. He's not an angry, nasty punk. He didn't fit.
Right. And I just remember my whole perception about Keith Moon was he was always on the edge. Like you were always waiting for him to fuck up and like make a mistake, but he'd always land on the downbeat no matter what Philly played. It was this intensity that you were, it was like a car wreck waiting to happen, but it never happened. It was great.
Right.
He was so wonderful. Yeah.
Well, he also invented his own. Think about how hard that is to invent your own style.
Yeah.
I mean, people like guitar players. There's a million.
But it's not hard if you don't know any other style.
Yeah, there you go.
It's not like they invented it. It's like they managed to bang something out, and everybody else said, "Go, it's okay." I remember when David Johansen started his solo career, and he was working with a different band, not with the Dolls anymore. And he was trying to record a certain song he had done, and he was telling him there was a certain lick that Sylvain had played, and he was trying to get his new guitar player to play it, and the guy couldn't do it. And they actually called Syl to come to the studio to show him how to do it. And the new guitar player is looking at Syl going, but that's not how you play guitar. Like you don't do that. Said, well, that's how you make this sound. Because Syl didn't know how to play guitar.
Right.
He just figured it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Rules is rules, but people make up their own sometimes.
Do you find that in photography, in your work?
Well, yeah, because I never had any rules. I didn't study photography. I didn't really know things. So I did a lot, on my own. And in fact, a lot of the pictures I'm known for are what we now call soft focus. For most of the beginning of my life, they called it out of focus. And people would always say, oh, it's a great picture, but can't you get it sharp? And then at one point, I actually brought in a contact, and I showed them that on the contact printer out of 35 pictures, there was 30 pictures that was sharp and clear. But the one that they liked was the one that caught the passion in the moment. I didn't have time to quite finish focusing.
Right. Wow.
And that's the one they liked. They could have picked one that was in focus.
Right.
But they picked the one that looked good. And that's the one that was soft. So now, after years of being out of focus, they call it a soft focus. As a definition of a style. And a lot of what I did, actually, I had to learn by doing it because I didn't take any classes. I didn't know things. At one point, I had an assistant. I have assistants who took classes,
Yeah, right.
And somebody said, oh, it's the Ansel Adams 3-zone method. I was like, what the hell is that? They said, well, you're doing it here. All your pictures know that. And I had no idea what they were talking about, except apparently I've been doing it all my life.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
And are you particular about your cameras? Or is that something? No.
I use what I can afford. I don't get to try out lots of different cameras. They're expensive.
Yeah.
You don't really get to borrow them too often,
Right.
And I do expensive camera. And besides, you have to use up film to test it out. No, I would get a camera that worked and I used it for a while. Right. I started out, my first pictures I took with my dad's Minolta camera, right. Which was an okay camera, not great. My first album cover was a Tina Turner picture. And I remember when I gave the picture, the art director was talking to me and I told him what I was doing. And he said, why don't you take this money and buy yourself a good camera? And in Japan, I made a contact with the Olympus camera company. And they gave me a set of cameras and I used them until 1990 when I discovered that the Canon company had invented amazing electronics, autofocus, auto exposure, auto everything. And it worked really well. Until then, like the Nikon had an autofocus, but it was very slow and not even that accurate, whereas the Canon was boing, boing, boing right there. The split second you touched the button, it was in focus.
Yeah.
It took me a while, actually, to learn how to work with it to get my kind of pictures.
Yeah.
Well, what about digital versus...
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
It's a digital world. You got to live in the digital world. I'm not an artist who thinks that there's so much more depth and color balance in the film than this or that. I was never trying to get the perfect technical picture. I was trying to get the passions and the feelings, rather than the facts.
Yeah.
So anyway, around 2000, cameras that were out, like the Canon, for instance, and a couple of smaller ones even, when the file size got big enough that you could sell a picture, I started using digital. I had a camera in the 90s. Apple made a point and shoot at one point, very early on. I don't even think they were selling it. I got a sample through somebody to try it out. And it was very primitive. It had a memory, built-in memory. There was no chip yet. And the memory held 12 photos. And then you'd have to go to the computer and download it and wow. Delete everything and start again. There was very little compensation as far as light or balance or anything like that. But it worked. It was a digital file instead of having to make a scan. But that wasn't very good. But by 2000, Canon and a couple of the other cameras came, with a file size that was big enough that it was a good quality, like a high-res scan that you send to a magazine and sell or license, get paid for. Yeah. And so then I started using digital because up until 2000, you could send a slide or transparency to a magazine. And they would either make the scan or they'd send it to the printers, and the printer would make the scan. After 2000, they wouldn't accept the slide or transparency. You have to send the scan. So there was no point in me shooting film and then making a scan, because making a scan is not just putting it in the scanner and pushing the button. You have to put it in the scanner, push the button, and then spend upwards of several hours cleaning off all the tiny dust bits that were on the film and balancing it like you would in the darkroom, making some areas lighter or darker or more contrasty or less. And all of that takes a lot of time. So if you're going to have to deliver a scan, you might as well use the digital camera and take a scan.
Right.
So I've been doing digital photography since 2000.
Yeah, that's very parallel to the studio world. As the bits got better and better.
Yeah, you couldn't do it until it was good enough. But once it was good enough, the only way to go, because that's what everybody was doing.
Yeah. Same with me. I had to give up analog in 2004. But now I mix at home and it works great. It is what it is. And it still sounds like music.
During COVID, I did photos for Joe Bonamassa at the Hit Factory studio here in New York. And his producer was in Australia, in Sydney, live on TV.
Wow.
And he had the whole 16 tracks, or 24 tracks, fed live, real time, into his studio in Sydney. So it was as if he was sitting on the other side of the panel.
Yeah.
That panel was on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Right.
But absolutely instantaneous, flawless connection.
Right.
Amazing. Totally amazing.
Yeah.
A little hard to get him in the picture, though, because he was just this little pot corner.
Right. For John and I, like, we are in this digital world now. The analog, I'm sitting in a room right now. I have tape machines all over the place. They don't get turned on at all. And it's sort of like I wonder why people are going back to listening to vinyl now, right? I've had this conversation with a lot of people who say it sounds better. We can debate that, right? But my recollection of listening to vinyl was you rolled the joint on the album cover. You sat down, you dropped the needle. Everyone sat around. When you wanted to listen to the song again, it was a process. And very similar to being in the recording studio where, it used to be you had to reel a tape. When the tape ran out, what do we do? Let's make some decisions. We got to decide what's going to be on this tape. These days, you have sort of endless hard drives. Right. You can record 1 million, and then you sit around with 1 million choices. And I would imagine taking pictures now digitally, like you don't have to load your camera. You're not going, shit, I only have 16 shots. I better make this great. Right. It doesn't cost as much. Does it affect your process at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, we used to be much more careful. Like you say, you only have a few shots left. You got to make them count. You don't want to have to spend $15 to do a whole new roll.
Right.
if you had 3 shots left and there was 4 people, you were like, oh crap, like for one person, you got to spend $15, $20. So yeah, there is that decision that you can just shoot endlessly. It's a kind of a pet peeve of mine that a lot of people put all of those pictures online.
Yeah.
That are editing and putting the 2 good ones.
Right.
But it changes the way you think about things. And certainly it's a lot easier to carry 1 camera instead of 3, because I used to have black and white film and color, daylight and tungsten colors. So you always had 3 cameras. I'm almost nervous carrying 1 because what happens if it breaks,
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's a lot of differences. The fact that you can just push a button and have a color picture or a black and white picture, and then process it in a million different ways. I mean, Photoshop is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't do a lot of changing. I remember when people were first talking about Photoshop and said, well, you could take this picture of the Ramones in the CBGB dressing room and you could change the background so they're standing in the country. And I was like, well, I get paid extra because they're in CBGB,
Right.
I'm not going to change that, So we don't do a lot of, switching heads or anything like that, although it could happen.
How does, because you do so much live stuff, how does lighting come into, because if you're at these places where you're not in a studio doing that stuff, you can't control it.
Well, I do the best I can.
Right.
And nowadays, actually, the cameras have gotten so sensitive. They're really work in the dark kind of things. I mean, I used to really have to fight with the film. And then there was a new kind of film that I got from the Army, a high-speed recording film that was 3 or 4 times as sensitive as Tri-X. But because musicians work by candlelight, and they don't want a flash going off in their face.
Right.
And actually, when I started, I was very purist, and I didn't like to use a flash at all. I felt that I was trying to capture a scene, and when you put a flash into it, it completely changes, what it looks like by putting a blast of white light that doesn't really exist in the natural world. So it wasn't until I started getting hired to take pictures at parties where you have to use a flash. But before that, I was very purist. I didn't use a flash for anything.
Also something that sort of blows my mind is back in the day when you were shooting on film, you couldn't, now you look at the camera, you see what you got. Same thing with...
Oh, back then you didn't know what you had until the next day when you get the pictures developed. And actually, even in the negative, you couldn't see. You'd have to develop the film and then make a print and then go, oh shit, his eyes are closed. I remember often when I would be leaving the show and people would say, hey, Bob, did you get some good pictures? And my answer was always, I hope so. Right. Because you think you got the moment.
Yeah.
But until you see the picture, you don't know if you got, 100th of a second before or after the moment.
But it must work in the reverse too, where all of a sudden you see something go, oh my God, the magic happened.
I did a picture of a woman named Tammy Faye Starlight. And she was doing a picture in a wedding dress on the roof. And I took the picture and I just kind of flashed for a second. I said, I think I got something there. There was a bird flying behind her. And even if I got the bird in the picture, was the bird crooked or a lump or did it have its wings out? Right. The bird was perfect. It was like if I had hung a stuffed bird up there, it couldn't have been better.
What year was this?
What, that picture?
With Tammy Faye. She's great. I'm a huge
that
fan.
was about 4 years ago. It was before lockdown.
Oh, great. So you go ahead, Stewart. You're on a roll.
Well, I'm digging this. So, because it's really such a parallel universe and totally refreshing to hear it from a different art form.
Well, we're both trying to help an artist express their ideas in a different medium. A musician is primarily singing or playing music, but then to be in the recording process, they need help, or to have their photograph taken, they need some outside person. So it's similar in the sense that you're trying to figure out what the hell their artistic statement is, and then to capture that in your medium. Rather than theirs.
Through the decades and decades, you've been at all these sort of iconic places. Are you asked to go, or do you say, oh shit, I really want to go there, I know I want to shoot that?
Yeah, sometimes I just need to be there.
Yeah.
Hopefully, most times people will ask me to be there and pay me for it.
Right.
But some things, like I've done a lot of work with the Sex Pistols, and I was involved from the beginning with the first version of the group, and then with Sid, and then I went on the bus with them, and it was a big part of what I was doing in the 70s. So then 25 years later, in the 90s, they had a reunion, and they were going to play in London and in Germany, and it was an expensive idea to go see a band in England, like not that I was going to have an exclusive or I was going to make enough money to cover it. And my wife and my agent said, you need to go.
Right.
You're going to be sitting home miserable. We don't want to be with you here if you're not there because you're thinking about being there. And so something like that, I just went on my own because I enjoyed it, and because I could. I had enough of a connection with the band that I could get a pass. I could hang out with them, I mean, a lot of the pictures I took at CBGB's, there was no commercial potential. That was a very big phrase in the 70s. We were talking about a band or a musician, no commercial potential. Meaning they were having fun and you might like them, but nobody was going to buy this music.
Right.
And that went for all the bands. Blondie, Patti Smith, Ramones, all those bands, when they started, there was no commercial potential. And then they got good.
Yeah.
And then it got better. And then people liked them. And then there was a huge commercial potential. Clive Davis once told Lisa Robinson not to talk so much about those bands at CBG because nobody above 14th Street wanted to know about that. And then he came down and he signed Patti Smith.
Yeah. Right. Boom.
Yeah. Boom. Things changed. But most of the bands, I still have drawers full of hundreds of bands nobody ever heard of.
So with your I have two questions. And the first one will be pretty easy and short. But in the long history of you doing this, is there any artist you wish you could have photographed that you never got to? Like, is there...
Otis Redding.
Okay, great.
Oh, wow.
That's perfect.
In the 60s, I was a huge fan of Otis. I never saw him play. I played his records millions of times. I always thought he was a super nice guy. And I never met him. And that's a regret. He died before I really got into the business.
Yeah, he died young.
Early on in the 70s, actually, I had an assignment from Cream Magazine to go to Macon, Georgia. And part of it was we were supposed to meet Otis's widow and visit his farm, and we never even got to do that. So I met Jimi Hendrix one time, but didn't get to photograph him. I would have liked to have done that a little more. But Otis Redding was the one I wish I could have met and had a conversation.
Great. And then my other question is, I'm just fascinated to know how you met John Lennon and Yoko. Like, how did that come about?
Oh, that was easy. Actually, because they lived around the corner from me, but I didn't know any way to just walk up and ring the bell. You don't do that in New York or anywhere, But then I was included in the first book of rock and roll photography. And the writer who was making the biographies for the book liked me and my pictures, and he was doing a story actually about the Elephants Memory Band that John and Stewart were using as a backup band. So it was kind of coming in the side door a little bit because he was doing an interview with John and Yoko about the Elephants.
Right.
And he asked me if I would take the pictures. And I did. And I got along with John and Yoko that first night in kind of a relaxed kind of way. And I didn't think they needed my pictures, so I didn't really send them any. I gave some to the magazine. But then a few weeks later, I got in contact. I ran into the drummer accidentally. And he said, man, we want to use your pictures in the album cover. And he brought me to John and Yoko's house. And that was the first time we sat around and talked all afternoon and got to know each other. And at the end of that day, Yoko said they wanted to be in touch with me and I should stay in touch and take more pictures. And I'm still in touch with Yoko today.
Wow. That's
50 years later. That was 1972.
Did the drummer happen to be Rick Frank?
Yeah. Rick and I were very good friends.
I knew him, yes. Good man.
Crazy man.
Yeah. Sure was.
We had a lot of good times together.
Yeah. But you maintained a relationship with John through the 70s?
Yeah.
Would they call you to photograph them, or would you just...
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When people sometimes describe me as John Yoko's personal photographer, they don't have an official photographer because, there's a lot of magazines to hire a photographer. But if John and Yoko wanted to call a photographer, when Sean was 1 month old and they wanted pictures to send their family, or a few months later when John wanted an identification picture for his green card, they called me.
See, part of the reason why this is very circuitous, But this came about because John's brother Tony Eventide, they did a John Lennon retrospective on his birthday.
For his birthday, yeah.
And you are referenced in there by myself because I remember, I don't remember the year, but it was on the Upper West Side, John and Yoko, and I referenced you were with them walking down Columbus. I didn't say hello. I got to go and say hello to these guys. These are three of my, like, most from every world. This is so important to me. And I just decided I'm going to walk away. But 40, 50...
But that was why John and Yoko liked New York.
Right. Yeah.
Because you see somebody famous, personally flip out, but not bother them.
Right.
John told me he was walking across the street one day and some girl turned, they was waiting at a corner for a light to change. And the girl looked up and saw it was him and her mouth dropped open and John just put his finger to his lips and like motioned to be quiet. And the girl calmed down, walked across the street with John Lennon. He said, goodbye, have a nice day. And that was her experience. But, like to say in New York, they felt comfortable.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Beatlemania kind of thing,
Right.
In New York, the way I say it is like if you see somebody who looks like Robert Redford in Des Moines, it's probably somebody who looks like Robert Redford. But if you see somebody who looks like Robert Redford in New York, probably him.
A lesson learned about 15 years ago, there was a little Italian place in the West Village, and I was sitting there. It was a quiet night, and we were at one table, and in the corner, I noticed, I just caught my eye, was Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, right? And there was no one in the restaurant, so they were looking sort of in our direction just because that's the way they were seated. And he caught me going like,
yeah.
So what he did was he taps Anne Bancroft on the shoulder and goes, he points at me like, and I just went, okay, enough. That's, I got the point.
I had a good one with David Bowie. I was going into Sterling Sound to get a record mastered, and he walked into the elevator in front of me, before me, and he stood by the buttons, and I walked in and said, "Oh, 6, please." And he did 6, and I didn't say anything the whole rest of the ride. I went up, and then we walked in. He went into his room. I went into mine, and I said to Greg Calby, "I was like, holy fuck, that was David Bowie."
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
Is there anything else we left out that you feel like would be...
I have my autobiography.
Oh, yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
Right place, right time.
Great.
All the stories behind the pictures and more.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, that's out now. It's wherever books are sold. Right place, right time is the name of the autobiography.
Everyone go out and buy it. We're going to buy it.
My pictures are available at the Morrison Hotel Gallery, online or in the actual stores in Los Angeles and New York.
Great. And if people want to, can they buy photos from you directly?
Yeah, through my website, bobgruen.com. Contact me. We'll work it out.
Great.
Excellent.
All right, Bob. See you around the West Village.
Much.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Have a great one.
You're beautiful, man.
Dude, thanks.
Okay. For extras from the episodes, like playlists, links, and videos, head over to gearclubpodcast.com. Sign up for the newsletter, and come say hi and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Gear Club Podcast. Thanks for listening.
And please, if you like what you hear, let us know and leave a review.